This is episode 452 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I'm very pleased to be joined this week by Judge Glock. He is Senior Director of Policy and Research at the Cicero Institute, based in Austin, Texas. And welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Judge.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and we met briefly, and I met some of your colleagues at the State Policy Network conference in Atlanta, and I really found your organization's engagement on some issues, particularly on the issue of homelessness, to be very compelling. But before we get into specifically homelessness, I want to talk a little bit about your organization, because it was new to me when I showed up in Atlanta a few months ago, and hadn't heard anything about you all, and I was really gratified to see some of your policy solutions. But you're based in Austin, Texas, and talk about the Cicero Institute and your involvement in it.
Yeah, so basically, we started up about 4 years ago, but really only expanded significantly beyond myself and one other person in really the past 2 years, where we've kind of exploded in size. We operate nationally, but we have a focus on the state level, and we focus on 9 different states, from Arizona in the west, Wisconsin in the north, down to Florida in the east, and of course our home state of Texas. And the basic model for the Cicero Institute is that although we do, of course, have most people at the Institute have very free market beliefs, we understand there's a lot of areas the government is always going to be involved in. And so how can we get the government to operate, insofar it is going to operate, in a sort of incentive-driven, market-like direction? And that motivates a lot of our work on things like parole and probation, homelessness, and et cetera. The other kind of distinctive aspect of us is, I mentioned our 9 states we work in. We really try to make sure every one of our ideas can be embodied in some clear, comprehensible state level law reform. And when we have a reform, we don't just kind of throw it over a transom and hope someone picks it up. We, through our C4 organization, work in some of these state legislatures to work with people on the ground. I spent a lot of time in Phoenix or Jeff City, Missouri, making sure our bills get passed, working with them on the ground, taking ownership of these bills. And as we say, kind of like what a lobbying shop does for corporations, but for good public policy. We really want to do the kind of A to Z sort of services for legislators. And, that manifests in some big successes last year, like in Missouri, we got most of our kind of model bill homelessness reform passed, which was fantastic to see.
Yeah, and an area that's, quite frankly, not many conservative policy organizations have engaged in is the homeless issue. It's something that has really exploded in recent years as being on people's minds. Certainly here in New Mexico's largest city of Albuquerque, it has been a top level issue. Describe just the process of what made you want to get involved in that issue, and anything about your organization's kind of expertise or take on that particular issue, because it's not something that a lot of free market organizations have been engaged in the past.
Yeah, so our institute actually started in San Francisco, which is obviously a bit of the epicenter of the crisis. And we moved along with obviously a good number of other Californians over to Austin as part of the Texodus, as they call it. And we faced similar problems with homelessness there. So it partially came just from where our institute is based and what we saw around us on a day-to-day basis. But my background as a former econ professor, I did a lot of work on the history of housing markets and urban governments and so forth. And when I started moving more into homelessness, I was hoping a lot of these sort of, how this housing relevant information would be very helpful in solving it, because like a lot of people looking at this issue, in kind of first blush, you assume that it's a housing issue. It's right there in the name. Homelessness is absence of a home. If you give someone a home, supposedly that's going to solve quote unquote homelessness. But as we've been working on this for 3+ years now, we've tried to show, and we found that housing, the lack of housing is usually the least important problem for people actually out on the streets. And we've tried to show kind of through our reforms, like what will actually help, which is a renewed focus on short-term shelter and treatment, an enforcement of existing laws on street camping and street sleeping, which is necessary to get people to get the help they need, and a reform of mental health commitment criteria, which is also very necessary for a lot of people on the streets. Now, that's not saying it's going to solve all the problem, but if you look at the areas where they're having some amount of success against homelessness, it's usually in areas that have done reforms in that level. And you look at the areas, most famously San Francisco and LA, who have failed to address homelessness, it's usually because a combination of allowing people to camp and sleep wherever they want, and a focus on sort of free housing, known as the housing first model, as kind of the sole solution to homelessness.
Yeah, and I want to expand a little bit about those solutions momentarily, but what's your take and your analysis on kind of why the problem seems to have gotten so much worse in recent years? Does it have something to do with COVID directly? Is it just the breakdown of society and lack of religious engagement? I'm sure it is multiple things, but where do you see these causes of the problem before we get into any of the solutions?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, like, long-term problems like the breakdown of the family are obviously crucial. A common sort of line, and some people work on this issue, is that usually homelessness is not that you ran out of rent money, it's that you ran out of family and relations to support you, which is usually kind of the last step before someone ends up on the street. And so people with a narrower network of family and close relations usually more likely to end up there. But those sort of breakdowns obviously are kind of universal. They're kind of across America, and they're kind of eternal problems that we've faced in the past 20, 40, 50 years now. But what you do see is areas not too far away, such as I often compare Houston and Austin in Texas, both very similar in population and growth and everything. And Houston has seen a significant decline in homelessness, and Austin's seen a significant increase, about 50% in each case, in each direction. San Antonio, also close to Austin, you've seen a significant drop in street homelessness, especially. So it's not just these global problems; it is these local and sometimes state level problems. And if I were to put the sort of onus on two main things, the first one would be this focus on housing first, that the goal of the government should be to get every person on the street, more or less, into what's called a permanent supportive housing unit, a kind of indefinitely free or heavily subsidized housing unit for as long as they live. And in the process of doing that, kind of a de-emphasis on short-term shelter, transitional housing, housing mandated with mandated services tied into it. All of that has kind of gone by the wayside. And if you look at cities like LA and San Francisco, they've kind of bought this housing first solution, hook, line, and sinker, which is we're going to build X thousand number of housing units over the next 10, 15 years. And that's going to, quote, solve homelessness in our cities. Mayor Gavin Newsom, when he was mayor of San Francisco before he became governor of California, said in the late around 2005 or 6, I believe, that we're going to solve homelessness in San Francisco in a decade. He said that, and he said we're going to do it by just giving everyone these housing units. And obviously, the exact opposite happened. You saw an explosion in homelessness in the streets. And then two is that usually combined with that is this housing first philosophy, the idea that this is obviously one of the most controversial, that you don't have to or shouldn't enforce any laws against public street sleeping, camping, etc. And what we've seen clearly is that the cities and states that enforce those laws, again, usually not in the sense of arresting people, putting handcuffs on people, criminalization, but just actually don't allow pervasive street camping and sleeping, tend to get a lot more people into those shelters, tend to get a lot more people into the mental health and drug and substance use treatment they need. And the cities that don't do that, that allow the blanket camping and sleeping with the hope that sooner or later they'll get these free housing units for the homeless, have seen incredible increases in homeless deaths. And so beyond the harm to the cities themselves, which is obvious, this has been just devastating for the homeless themselves. The number I often cite is LA for a while used to enforce some laws against street camping and sleeping in their Skid Row district, limited the number of homeless people there. They got homeless deaths down significantly. And an academic study in 2010 showed they reduced homeless deaths significantly by this enforcement to about 500 homeless people a year. Still an incredible number of deaths. But since 2014, they basically abandoned any enforcement whatsoever. And now they have about 2,000 homeless people die every year in the streets of LA. You're picking up 5 body bags off the streets of LA about every single day. And clearly that's a disaster. I think one of the reasons the issue has increased in prominence is just everyone's realized the current model that a lot of these cities using is an unmitigated disaster. And so we try to provide these alternative solutions.
Yeah, so it seems like there is a policy component here. Obviously, we briefly talk about some of the underlying issues with regard to homelessness, but there are policy incentives or policy decisions being made in these cities predominantly, but those cities tend to be downstream of a lot of other politics and policies, starting with the federal level, and the way these programs oriented to the homeless are funded and what their incentives are. So is that one of the many issues relating to this crisis that is contributing to it? Is just kind of the financial incentives, not just of the cities, but the way the nonprofits involved in addressing homelessness are incentivized as well?
Absolutely. So, one of the most damaging things that's happened in this space is the federal government's intervention in basically mandating of housing first as sort of a sole philosophy for every nonprofit and every local government that gets federal funds, which they did in 2013. The federal government required basically everyone to adhere to this housing first philosophy. Now, there's 2 aspects of this that are very dangerous. One is that, de-emphasis on short-term shelter, transitional housing services that I mentioned, and a focus on this permanent supportive housing, which just, again, has often in places led to reductions in necessary shelter beds and so forth. But to me, the more damaging aspect of this is that the idea behind housing first is that since you need to encourage people to get into these housing units, you can't have any mandates on services inside them whatsoever. You can't require people to set plans for how to get work. You can't require them to have a mental health checkup. If they are schizophrenic, you can't require them inside the housing unit to take a pill, a psychotropic medication to help improve their condition. So what we've seen is that the federal government has given a lot of money to a lot of nonprofits, usually, related to our actual housing developers, who, not surprisingly, get a fair amount of funds to do this, to build these new housing units, then to fill them with people who they can't tell to do anything whatsoever. And you just see incredible rates of death and substance use in these apartments. You often see worse results than even leaving them on the street. There was recently a randomized control trial, kind of the gold standard of scientific research out of Denver, where they gave people these free apartments. And they said, these free apartments help people reduce the amount of interaction with police and reduce the number of hospitalizations. But they had in a little footnote that, well, this reduction is among lived participants. in the experiment. And so, well, what does that mean? Well, we mean about 14% of all the people who got these apartments died within 3 years, usually from drug or other related issues. And that was a much higher rate than those simply left on the street. So you're basically providing people in the grip of a drug addiction or in the grip of a mental illness, an isolating free apartment, and then expecting them to get better, which is obviously not the case, and any commonsensical person would understand that's not how to help someone in that condition improve.
Yeah, and I honestly don't know how much housing is considered a part of what Albuquerque is doing or trying to do. They have something they call tiny home villages, but they require them to be clean upon moving in, and those have kind of gone over like a lead balloon, where the folks were not interested in using those facilities, so they've been a very expensive but empty in terms of number of people using them. What it seems to be in Albuquerque is people doing the open air camping thing, although we had something called safe outdoor spaces. Is that a concept you're familiar with, where they kind of create a plot of land available where you have people camp out, but there is at least kind of like a structure there with restrooms and whatnot?
Yeah,
It comes up, I think it was in Las Cruces, but Denver had it as well. What's your take on those?
yeah. So we've heard different names for them, and like you mentioned, tiny home villages. They're also what called sanctioned camping sites, structured camping sites. And the basic idea of this as kind of a worst case scenario, you need some place for people to stay and you don't have enough shelter, beds, or something else, those can make sense. In an area like, LA or something, when you have 60,000 plus homeless people out in the streets, like getting someplace with basic security, sanitation, etc., can be a big step up. Now, as you mentioned with the tiny home villages, when you make minimal requirements on that, such as, again, sobriety or some other service requirements, you don't see a lot of take up, which is actually a lot of unsheltered homeless people's main complaint about many shelters themselves that require some amount of services or sobriety. And that's a problem. And a lot of people just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, if they don't want to go in, that's okay. But that means you're effectively leaving someone with a severe drug addiction out on the street. And if you don't also do that enforcement out on the street to get people to move into that next shelter, and that's services, you're going to have someone basically with a heroin or fentanyl or other addiction who's going to slowly die out on that street. Now, the basic numbers we provide, that we always cite this UCLA study. It says about 75% of the people on the street have a severe substance use issue, drug or alcohol. About 75% have a severe mental illness, and the majority have both. Almost everyone has one or the other. So when we're talking about the unsheltered population, again, not the whole homeless population, includes a lot of people, families, et cetera, just need a short time in shelters, then move on to the next stage of their lives. When we're talking about that, what most people think of when they think of homelessness, that people on the streets, we're dealing with a population that is just riddled with mental illness and drug addiction. If you're not talking about or dealing with those issues, you're making the problem worse.
Yeah. So, how do you actually help address those issues? There's no question that mental illness and addiction are incredibly huge parts of modern society, but especially the homeless problem and that situation. I'm skeptical, quite honestly, how much government or government service providers can do to solve a lot of those problems. It seems like there needs to be an element of, just pulling them out of society and putting them somewhere where they can't harm themselves or others. But what's your take on actually addressing those problems with some kind of, government programs or some variation of what the government is doing now?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I mean, there's some of these issues, there's not a policy lever the sort of government can just pull and, we're gonna end substance use or into mental health problems. Like you said, a lot of this will have to be done through nonprofits, through families, through local groups, churches, et cetera, that know how to deal with these problems. There's a great group outside of my hometown of Austin, entirely privately funded, called Community First, kind of set up as an alternative to the housing first model, which is, well, we need to get people together in a new community to help them recover from the problems they have. But the one thing we can definitely do is stop making it worse. The government can stop feeding addictions, basically. And as I wrote in a recent piece called Subsidizing Addiction for City Journal, not only is the current government model right now, which is this giving free housing to severe addicts, dangerous, based on what we know of decades of research into what's called the check effect, that when you give addicts more funds or support, not surprisingly, that addict is going to exacerbate his drug addiction. Right now, the federal government and most of these local cities use a point system for the homeless to decide who gets the free housing. And you get extra points, as it's known, for abusing more drugs, for overdosing, for committing acts of violence, for, if you're a family, for abusing your kids, shockingly enough. One of my favorite examples in Massachusetts, the government there gives you 4 points to a free house if you can show that you're abusing drugs and you're not in recovery. You're down to 1 point if you've actually been in recovery for up to a year, but you get a bonus 2 points for overdosing over the past 12 months. So the government right now is not only giving free housing to addicts and often directing it to addicts and saying we don't have any requirements inside. It's saying the way to get into this housing is to commit acts of violence, to abuse drugs, and to, if you have children, to abuse them as well. Under the assumption that, well, these are the most vulnerable people, we need to help them. But as I point out, that actually telling homeless people that the way to get ahead is to make your life as bad as possible. So we can stop that kind of stuff. And some basic things, such as that there's a thing called recovery housing. In 2018, there was a bipartisan bill in Congress which gave housing under the condition of sobriety. There's these groups like called Oxford House, that small groups of people get together in a suburban style house. They support each other, they have to work, they have to stay clean, and they help each other move to the next stage of their lives. If we can get more money for stuff like that, which is what we've advocated in place like Missouri, where we got our bill passed, that's clearly superior to this free housing for with no requirements for addicts like the government is doing right now.
So obviously, free housing or heavily subsidized housing isn't necessarily going to get the job done. Talk about those nonprofits. There's some nonprofits that tend to be engaged in providing services to the homeless, and they have some strange incentives sometimes in terms of, or no real incentives. But talk about how that can be a lever to improve outcomes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of great people working in this space today, and nonprofits, for profit, just not even incorporated or so forth. And I don't want to disparage all them, but not surprising when there's a system with billions and billions of dollars coming around. There's a lot of groups, and again, including a lot of housing developers, just like any private, that are paid basically for what's called heads on beds. You want to maximize the number of people that you get in your homeless people you get in your unit, and not surprisingly, they want to maximize the sort of concerns about how many homeless people are out there and how many people need these free beds. But once they get them in there, that's basically the end of their job, according to the government. Some of the housing, the nonprofits are even worse in the sense they get paid for every time they, quote, contact a homeless person. So they send a guy out in the street, tell them, you guys need a sandwich, you guys need an apple, can I get you any, sometimes in some places, frankly, syringes or drug paraphernalia. And even if they say yes or no, it's, oh, we've contacted a homeless person. We've done our job according to our government contract. So what we've done in Missouri and what we've been pushing in other states is what's become common elsewhere, which is a pay for performance contract. Let's look at the thing which we actually care about, and try to pay people who maximize that. So for the unsheltered, that's reducing time in jail, on the streets, and in hospitals. For the people in the shelters, that's making sure they don't return to the streets and making sure they get better employment outcomes afterwards, and basing at least some of the pay off those metrics. We want them to, a lot of the nonprofits want to do this and they want to care about those ends, but the government's just paying them basically for, maximize the number of people inside the shelter or the housing unit, or, talking to them once a month. And if they don't have the incentive to do that, of course, they're not going to do that. Or they're just going to, build out as many $750,000 homeless units, which is unfortunately not an uncommon price for some of these, as they can get away with.
Now, you mentioned and you presented some model legislation when we were in Atlanta. There's obviously federal policy as well and federal incentives. Then there's city policies as well. And again, just like the homelessness problem itself has many different aspects to it, solving it has numerous different people, hands in the pot, so to speak, that need to be brought to bear. You've worked at the state level. Is that where you think the maximum benefit can be derived? Would it be better if Washington took this on, but they simply won't? And what about urban, big city politicians? Where do they fit into the mix?
Yeah, we work at the state level because we do think that's where you can have the kind of maximum impact relative to effort right here. There's a lot of states that want to do something. There's an eagerness there, and they're willing to change. Unfortunately, a lot of big city mayors and the federal government right now do not want to change. But, again, that is where a lot of the problems are coming from. I compare some of those cities, even the same state, San Antonio and Austin, et cetera. San Diego and LA. San Diego has done much better at reducing homelessness than Los Angeles. But that federal money is frankly, so poisonous in some ways by requiring these things of giving out housing to addicts, by basing it on how damaged someone is and how much damage they do, by telling everyone they have to adhere to a housing first model. They're basically telling all these nonprofits that there's only one way in America that you're supposed to, quote, solve homelessness, which, when we go to nonprofits and others, they say, hey, we're interested in changing, but, we basically had to sign a contract with the federal government that said, this is how you have to do everything. And, if we're going to get that federal money, that's, they pay the piper, they're going to call the tune. And so, there's some good legislation. As I said, we've gotten versions of it in Missouri, like kind of close to a full version of Missouri. We've gotten pieces passed in Utah and Georgia and elsewhere. But the federal level, there's a good piece now. Barr and Chip Roy, Congressman Barr and Roy, have passed a bill to allow mandated services in these housing first units. And I've been pushing them to just entirely take out substance use disorder as a quote unquote disability that allows you to get housing. At the very least, the federal government shouldn't be mandating that getting housing is dependent on you having a drug addiction, as if that was a back injury or something else. That's not helping anybody get clean. And so we can do a lot at all of these levels. And again, the evidence is on what's the difference between California and Texas is clear. The difference in cities inside that is clear, but we definitely also need to attack that federal problem.
Yeah, well, I totally agree. And like I said, you've worked on those model bills. Now, some would say there's a housing or a homeless industrial complex, I should say, and that these special interests, when you take them on, it gets pretty exciting and dicey pretty quickly for a lot of the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
What is specifically so problematic about trying to engage, what you would call the homeless advocacy community and try to get them to change the the approaches that clearly seem to not be working in New Mexico and across the country. Why is it so, challenging for organizations like yours and mine to get them to maybe see the error of their ways and shift directions in terms of some of these policies?
Yeah, so it's just an article of faith among all of these advocacy groups. And yeah, we've called it, and others have, the homeless industrial complex, because it is that substantial and that powerful in some of these areas. It's an article of faith among them that, like, again, it's a purely a housing issue, and then once they build enough housing units, that's going to solve the whole problem. And that two, in the meantime, we all just have to kind of allow people to live on the streets wherever they want until every one of those persons get a free house. And so they're just viciously committed to this idea. Again, some out of good faith and some obviously have self-interest. They can be pretty brutal on the ground. We've had legislators we work for explain that they will kill other bills that they're working on unrelated to homelessness merely because they tried to work on one of the homeless bills that we've advocated, which some of them said we've never seen any group do that before for us. They're just that kind of anyone who's worked even outside the legislature, who's worked with us to try to work inside the legislature, they will also try to kill their other bills. Like they can be pretty brutal on this. They see themselves on God's mission, and anything that will contradict them will feel they have to go down. Now, the strange thing to me is I think a lot of them know they're kind of in a losing battle. When any of these sort of camping bans comes up, it wins overwhelmingly, even in the most liberal states in the country. Austin, my hometown, we helped pass one of these camping bans, and it was a 58-42 vote for the ban, and this is one of the most liberal cities in the country. Even San Francisco voted for this, and even though the city refused to enforce it, basically people everywhere, and polls agree with this, that nobody supports allowing anybody to camp out, live wherever they want in the public streets. You just can't have a city that allows that to happen. And so I think they realize that, kind of the mass of the population is against them on this. And when you survey people too, should people in the street get a free housing with no service requirement? Absolutely not. This is, again, not a 50-50 issue. This is an 80-20 issue. And so when you combine these sort of things and begin to put these up in the legislature in a way that they haven't, these interest groups be very shocked because no one else, as you mentioned, is really working on this issue. So they get pretty brutal when it comes to pushing back.
Yeah, totally understand, and it's never fun to advocate for limited government and individual liberty and all these things, and when people have a financial stake that and also they feel like they have the moral high ground, and how dare you attack the way we've been doing this for a very long time. It's pretty tough. We haven't taken this issue on headlong. Mostly we've just pointed out the problems and failures at the local level, but it sounds like there's a lot of things that need to be done at the state level, and certainly in Washington, D.C. as well. Let's talk briefly about housing before we take this to a conclusion. You mentioned a few times that just housing first is not the answer, but there is an issue of housing broadly speaking, and you can feel free to reiterate the separation between it and the homeless situation, the homeless crisis. But encouraging more housing in urban areas, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to improve homelessness, but it is an important issue. And talk about public housing and broader housing policy, and how state and local governments can improve overall conditions by freeing up housing.
Yeah, totally. So I do want to state that there is evidence that there's a relationship between housing costs and homelessness. I'm not disputing that higher housing costs is going to cause some number of people to become homeless that wouldn't without lower housing costs, and mainly
Fair
we're
enough.
talking about, yeah, market rate housing. But the distinction here that I offer is that's mainly going to affect that kind of sheltered homeless, the people who are in families, who are circulating in and out of shelters, who need a little help short term to get back on their feet. It's not going to have a huge effect again on that, what most people think of as homeless, is the unsheltered, the people in the streets. That's the people with the drug and mental illness issues. And so, but obviously just for the good, to get fewer people in shelters, fewer people, more people in affordable housing is a great thing. Now, one of the things I've written a lot about is that a lot of these groups that are interested in more affordable housing, such as the YIMBY movement, which I've supported and worked with before, the Yes in My Backyard, to encourage more housing in cities. They're doing a lot of fantastic stuff that people believe in free markets, obviously should support. Now, the strange thing to me, though, is they're kind of solely focused on densifying and this infill development inside major cities, or in kind of near-in suburbs and so forth. But the strange thing is, most of America has fairly affordable housing, actually. And it's not because they focus on building up huge apartment complexes downtown. It's largely because they allow this kind of sprawling single-family development to occur in a way that's basically impossible in California, New York, Massachusetts, and elsewhere. And basically, when you look at places like Nashville, Columbus, Ohio, Atlanta, etc., relative to most of the globe, they have some of the most affordable housing prices on earth. And they have tons of single family zoning. They have tons of sprawling development, and the things some of these advocacy groups kind of decry. And so, in order to get housing costs down, I often say, it's good to encourage more of that development in the city. We can do more of that. But in a sense, California has tried that, to focus solely on densifying downtown areas. And they have the densest urban cities in the country right now. California does. But they also have the highest housing prices. The areas where, if we're really going to get housing prices down, you need to not just have that infill and increased density, but you need to allow these more greenfield development lands to open up for housing. That's what makes Columbus, Ohio, Nashville, etc., affordable. They allow these people, the developers, to grow out as well as up. And I just think, in terms of getting housing costs down, we as state, city, national level, we need to spend a lot more time thinking about how we can grow our cities out to approximate those cities that are doing a good job on housing prices.
Yeah, and I know you're probably not too familiar with Albuquerque. We do have some challenges here with the mountain range, an Air Force base, and tribal lands tending to encircle a lot of the city of Albuquerque, but there's a lot of ways to improve upon the current situation as well. Yep. So appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness on these issues. How do people find more out about you and your organization? And is there anything else that you want to share with us that we might have missed or glossed over today?
No, I mean, that's all it. I mean, maybe the last thing I just mentioned very briefly, and we talked about freedom and individual liberty. Obviously there's a concern about camping bans and things like this, where it's the government involved in enforcing these laws. And I do want to emphasize the goal of those and the places that implement them well is not criminalization or arresting people willy-nilly. It's usually requiring people to move in services. And the unfortunate kind of connection between this housing price and the homelessness thing that we've talked about is, right now the government is in a very weird situation where they are very restrictive on everything you can do on your private land. You try to install a new sink, you'll get 1 million permitters in there to do it. But they're very open about whatever you can do on public land. You can camp, defecate, you should use heroin, do whatever, which is exactly 180 degrees from what the government should do. It should be enforcing the rules on public land and allowing you and your private land to do more of what you want to do. And so I think it works well with a model of individual liberty and the basic responsibilities of government. But overall, this CiceroInstitute.org is a place to look. My recent piece, Subsidizing Addiction, in City Journal. You can find some of these other writings, just Judge Glock on Google or elsewhere.
And that's Cicero Institute, for those not familiar with the Roman politician and philosopher. So
Right.
thank you very much, Judge, and really appreciate your spending some time with us today. Hopefully we can draw some attention to good solutions to some of these serious challenges that we face here in New Mexico. All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or have your Google Home play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.